Hello, my American history students. This is week 4 of your online learning, and this is your first video of the week. Last week we talked about all of the issues and compromises aimed at preventing the Union from being dissolved before the Civil War begins. So this week we're going to talk about the Civil War, how it came about, what started it, and what became of the outcome of the Civil War. So we're going to get right into it with the dissolution of the Union. So the presidential election of 1860 was the final push over the edge of unhappiness for the Southern states. They were shocked at Abraham Lincoln's new position for a U.S. president. Southern states did not waste any time waiting to see how the newly elected president might do as the new nation's leader. They felt it was time for a big change. Tension grew after Abraham Lincoln was elected president of the United States. Southern states felt the time was right to now make a change. They were afraid that Lincoln's election would lead to the end of their right to make their own decisions as states in the South. They were especially concerned with the U.S. government as they thought they would abolish or do away with their practice of owning slaves. On December 20th, 1860, South Carolina's citizens voted and unanimously agreed, meaning everybody agreed, that the Union, now subsisting between South Carolina and other states under the name of the United States of America, is hereby dissolved. With that declaration or announcement, South Carolina became the first of the Southern states to break away from the United States of America. Less than 3 weeks later, Mississippi became the second state to leave the U.S. By the end of January, the states of Florida, Alabama, Georgia, and Louisiana had also left the Union. Not everyone in the South wanted the states to leave the Union, however. Some people, known as cooperationists, wanted the South to work out its differences with the North. They wanted the South to remain part of the Union. The disagreement over seceding, so you're going to keep hearing that word, seceding, meaning to break away from the Union. So the disagreement over seceding eventually caused West Virginia to become a separate state on June 20th, 1863. And I kind of talked about that last week, how there was division among Virginia, and so they split, and that's how we have West Virginia. However, the southern states that had succeeded by early 1861 wanted to protect what they thought was their right to own slaves. They wanted to have the freedom to make their own decisions. They formed the Confederate States of America. The Confederacy selected its own president, Jefferson Davis of Mississippi. By April 1861, the lines of conflict were clearly drawn. Northern Yanks and Southern Rebs, you're going to hear that a lot, were set to fight against one another to protect their property, rights, and values. All right, so it's all coming to a head now. We have clear battle lines drawn. So now we're going to talk about the blue and the gray. What do you think that means, the blue and the gray? Think about it for a second before I get into it. What could that possibly signify? All right, let's talk about what event actually led up to the first shots being fired. So we're going to talk about Fort Sumner. The first states began to secede, remember secede means to break away, from the Union in December of 1860. At that time, U.S. soldiers were stationed in South Carolina. Led by Major Robert Anderson, soldiers climbed into boats and took control of Fort Sumner in Charleston Harbor. The people in Charleston were angry that the Union soldiers had taken the fort. They considered it a violation of their rights. The next day, Confederate forces took control of 3 nearby forces. They wanted to remove the Union soldiers from Southern soil. The Union held control of Fort Sumner for almost 4 months. President Abraham Lincoln ordered that supplies be sent to the soldiers. The Confederates sent messengers by boat to speak with Major Anderson. They wanted him to surrender, but Anderson would not give up. By 4:30 a.m. on April 12, 1861, the Confederates began firing upon Fort Sumner. The Civil War had officially begun. The attack lasted 34 hours. The Union soldiers fired back, but they were forced to surrender. Surprisingly, not one soldier on either side was killed in battle. Like it or not, the United States found itself now in the middle of a war that neither side was prepared for. Both the North and the South needed to make improvements to their armies. Soldiers needed to be trained. Some men signed up voluntarily. on their own, while the government drafted others to serve in the military. When soldiers were drafted, they were ordered to fight whether they wanted to or not. Northern men followed President Lincoln's request that they fight to keep the United States together. Eventually, it became clear that the men of the North were also fighting for the freedom of slaves being held in the South. The Northern soldiers were mostly from poor families, and many were European immigrants. Remember, we talked about immigration and all coming here via Ellis Island for the Industrial Revolution. African Americans were also allowed to serve in the Union Army and wore the Union blue uniforms. Southerners believed they were fighting for their freedom to leave the Union. They wanted states to have the right to make their own decisions, and they were ready to defend the Southern way of life. They were willing to fight for the right to own slaves. Many of the Southern soldiers were poor farmers as well. They wore gray uniforms on the battlefield. So we have blue battle uniforms for the Unions or the Yanks, and we have gray uniforms for the Southern Reds. All right, so we're going to talk about one of the big battles, the Battle at Bull Run, also known as the Battle of Manassas. In the summer of 1861, Northerners wanted President Lincoln to hit the Southerners with full force. Most people felt that the North would only need one major win to crush the South and bring the Union back together again. A plan was made for the Union to capture the city of Richmond, Virginia. In July, troops marched towards the city. The Union soldiers were not well trained. They moved slowly and did not follow orders very well. The Confederates built up their defenses along Bull Run Stream. At first, the Union soldiers seemed to be winning the battle quite easily. A crowd of supporters were gathered to watch the battle. The people were excited to see the Union Army defeat the Southern rebels. But the Union plan fell apart quickly. There was great confusion and panic. The Union troops started to retreat or move back. Many soldiers dropped their rifles and just ran away. By the end of the day, over 4,000 soldiers died. The Union knew that the Confederate soldiers were serious about fighting back. Remember, they didn't anticipate this big of a retaliation. They thought they were just going to be these farmers with guns, not trained, not really going to be defending the land that well. So the Union thought that after this battle was done, the skirmish would be over, the Confederate states would come back into the Union, and it would be a quick war that was won in basically one battle. But the Union didn't anticipate how loyal the Southern soldiers were to their cause and how much they were willing to fight for what they believed. So everyone soon realized that the war was not going to come to a quick end, but both sides have shown now that they're in it to win it. So now we're going to get into some more conflict. We're going to talk about the Emancipation Proclamation. So the first battles of the Civil War were small compared to the battles that followed, and we're going to talk more about these battles in the next video. So this is going to be part 1 and part 2. By July of 1862, both the North and the South had suffered a heavy loss of soldiers. The Union had won few battles, and the end of the war was nowhere in sight. President Lincoln was very concerned about how the war was unfolding. People urged the leader to abolish slavery. However, President Lincoln knew the war was much more about than getting rid of just slavery. He wanted to keep the Union together, too. After a year of battles and decisions, Lincoln knew it was time to end slavery altogether. President Lincoln met with his group of advisors, people who offer and share his opinions and ideas. They told him to wait until the North had won a major battle before announcing the end of slavery. This chance came in September of 1862 after the Battle of Antietam in Maryland, also known as the Battle of Sharpsburg, and we're going to get into that in the next video. Over 23,000 men were killed there. The Union Army forced the Confederates back into Virginia. The time was right for Lincoln to announce his plan. On September 26, 1862, President Lincoln made the Emancipation Proclamation. Lincoln warned the Southern states that most Southern slaves would be forever free if the rebellious states did not rejoin the Union by January. Lincoln also announced former slaves were free to join the Union Army. There were mixed reactions to Lincoln's announcement. Some people thought the war was being fought only to free the slaves and not necessarily to bring the nation back together again. Others felt the Emancipation Proclamation was the best thing that could have ever happened to bring the country together again. After Lincoln signed the proclamation into law on January 1, 1863, many slaves fled north to join Union forces. The Emancipation Proclamation helped to free slaves, caused Southern plantation owners to lose workers, and helped increase the number of soldiers fighting for the Union cause. All right, so the last thing I want to talk about today is the differences in the leaders. So we have Ulysses S. Grant, who's the leader of the Union Army, and we have Robert E. Lee, who is going to be the leader of the Confederate Army. Okay, so both the North and the South had strong leaders for their troops. Ulysses S. Grant was born in Ohio. His parents were simple, hardworking people. Grant also attended the U.S. Military Academy at West Point. Like Lee, but Ulysses did not do well in school. He was, however, an excellent horseman and mathematician. During the Mexican-American War, Grant served as an engineer in the Army alongside General Robert E. Lee. Before President Lincoln chose Grant to lead the Union Army, Grant worked as a farmer, real estate agent, and cloth store owner. Voters elected Grant President of the United States twice after the Civil War. He spent much of his presidency fighting for the civil rights of African Americans. Robert E. Lee, who was the Confederate leader, was born in Virginia to well-educated parents. His father was the governor of Virginia, and Robert's mother encouraged him to be religious and responsible. Robert received an education at the U.S. Military Academy at West Point, where he graduated at the top of his class. He served in the Army after graduation and later served as superintendent of the school he had attended. During the Mexican-American War, Lee served as a quartermaster, which is an Army officer. He was a smart man who carefully studied the military leaders he worked with. President Lincoln asked Robert E. Lee to head the Union troops at the beginning of the Civil War, but Lee felt he owed the South, especially his home state of Virginia, his allegiance or his loyalty first. He became leader of the Confederate States of the American Army. After the Civil War, Lee became the president of Washington College in Virginia. All right, so I don't have questions for you this week and I don't have a worksheet, but what I want you to do instead is I want you to make a T chart. You draw a big T, the line down the middle, and I want you to contrast the South and the North. So talk about what the North was doing with its Union troops, who its leaders were, how they were successful, how it was difficult for the Union, what did they stand for, who were its leaders, okay? And then on the other side, you're gonna put the South. What color were their uniforms? What did they stand for? What were they fighting for? What were their problems? What were their successes, okay? And so you can type up your answers and you can email them to me, or you can hold up your T-chart and show it to me in our next Zoom meeting. And we will be talking about some of the Civil War battles more in depth in our next video, okay? So I will see you guys Wednesday morning in our Zoom meeting, and I look forward to seeing your answers. Bye.